Okay, hello. Can you all hear me okay? Brilliant. Okay, so first off, thank you for the organizers for inviting me. Actually, Frank Ferretti, who I think maybe the only Hungarian here. Is anyone else Hungarian? No, just Frank? Okay, so Frank invited me to give this talk as I'm based in Budapest. And I've been asked to speak particularly on the Hungarian Revolution of '56, but I want to discuss this obviously in the context of the theme of the whole conference, which is the old roots of the new disorders. And so I want to first talk about Hungarian history and culture to set the context for 1956, then 1956. And then I want to offer some thoughts on what we might perhaps learn from looking at the 1956 Hungarian Revolution for understanding some of the disorders we see today in the Anglosphere. So I'm a Brit, mostly, living in Hungary, and I've been there about a year. I'm trying to learn a lot about Hungary. I'm also trying to learn Hungarian, which is no easy task. But my favorite Hungarian phrase really brings together both of these things. And it's a very well-known saying in Hungary, and Frank's about to shake his head in disappointment at my pronunciation. But the phrase is Tubic veset Mohácsnál, and it means more was lost at the Battle of Mohács, which basically means it could be worse. So Mohács was a famous defeat at the hands of the Ottomans in 1526, a defeat that essentially ended Hungary's existence as an independent nation and wiped out the country's rulers and about 1,000 of the nobility, which was most of it. The reason I like this phrase is that it really captures something essential and particular in the Hungarian character or soul or psyche, depending on how you want to view it, the way that they seem to be almost fiercely proud of their tragedies and their defeats. And this has, I think, implications for how we understand not just the revolution of '56, but the relevance of that later defeat, that story as it was described in '56, of awe-inspiring courage in a doomed cause and of ruthless cruelty, but the relevance of later defeat to us here today in the Anglosphere. But before I go on, it's important to first note that there is actually a surprising amount of common ground between Brits and Hungarians. In fact, just as how we Brits have a special relationship with America, but the Americans don't really know about this, so the Hungarians are themselves great Anglophiles, but we hardly realize it. Their parliament is modeled on ours, but slightly bigger. Shakespeare is basically seen there as a great Hungarian writer. Whereas the Germans don't get Monty Python, and the French don't like it, as a lot of the jokes are about them, the Hungarians love it, and they get it, so much so that in the 90s, a troupe called the Ravens simply adapted it wholesale into Hungarian to great acclaim and a lot of recognition. More superficially, the structures of our countries are very similar. In general, the UK has one big sort of liberal capital city and a pretty conservative country. Hungary is the same. Budapest is a very liberal city and a pretty conservative country. They have Lake Balaton up in the northwest, the biggest landlocked lake in Europe. And we've got the Lake District in the northwest. They have Esztergom with the biggest cathedral on the border with Slovakia, which used to be part of Hungary. We have Durham with the biggest cathedral on the border with Scotland. But also regionally as well, we have obviously in Britain, we have England, but we also have Scotland, Ireland and Wales. And they have what they call Felvidík, Dubdík and Erdély, which is Slovakia, northern Serbia and Transylvania, which all used to be part of Greater Hungary. Now those are quite superficial similarities, but there are more profound ones. The main similarity, I think, is probably actually also the source of the greatest difference, which is this, that here in Britain, we're an island surrounded by water, but the Hungarians are arguably an island surrounded by land. They are a culture that's very distinct from all the cultures around it, linguistically not least. And this difference goes a long way, I think, to explaining our two nations' very different histories. Indeed, the different historical trajectories perhaps can be expressed in a simple chemical equation, which is simply H2O. How different would ours be without the channel? And how different would theirs be with it? For inasmuch as our history here is one of one victory or triumph, or in fact lucky escape after another, from Agincourt to the Armada, from Trafalgar to Waterloo, from World War I to World War II, the history of Hungary is precisely the opposite. The invasion of the Tatars in 1241, destroying up to 80% of settlements and killing 25% of the population. Mohács, which I mentioned, which also began the subsequent occupation of the Ottomans. They occupied Hungary for about 150 years. And then they fell under Habsburg rule, which they then failed to shake off in the failed 1848 revolution. And then the loss of World War I, which they took part in on the side of Austria-Hungary precisely because they'd failed to shake it off. And then they lost as punishment for World War I 2/3 of their territory in the Treaty of Trianon in 1920 and 1/3 of the people who lived in those territories. They then joined the Axis powers in 1940, largely in the hope of reclaiming the territory lost in Trianon, leading not only to defeat in World War II, but subsequent occupation and colonization by the Soviets, leading in the end to the most recent famous failure, the subject today, the 1956 revolution, which was, as with so many previous hinge points in Hungarian history, recognized as a heroic failure. Now, for we in the UK, we of course take a close interest in our history, but it is somewhat dispassionate, I think, as if observed through glass casing in a museum with the comforting knowledge that all had a happy ending. We think a lot about our history in an analytical sense, but I don't think, feel much about it. We are well read about it, but that history does not live in our souls. We talk about it, but it doesn't make us fall into silence. Why would it, if there is little to lament, and if it is not a source of great grievance and injustice? For the Hungarians, it is quite different. Their history is very close to the surface and relevant to the present. Their history is alive, not dead. The sense of injustice burns brightly. One scholar noted, writing in the 1980s, a literary scholar, that, quote, the Hungarian national obsession is with history, particularly the tragedies and defeats, an obsession that spans generations and transcends politics. And the Hungarians are fiercely proud of this history of trauma and tragedy, of defeat and loss, this peculiarly melancholic, peculiarly Magyar history. The Hungarian poet Endre Ady perhaps captured the spirit of this best in the following famous poem. This is translated into English, but in English it goes, "If there be a God, he need not spare a people used to beatings, a callow, tepid-hearted gypsy people, just thrash and thrash and thrash. If there be a God, he need not pity me, I was born a Hungarian. Send no holy dove with sprig of green, just beat and lash. If there be a God, he may drag us right from the earth to the gleaming sky. Give us not half a minute's peace, for that will be an end of us, an end." If you'll indulge me a rather strained analogy, in a sense, we might, in fact, think of national cultures as akin to gardens. For a garden to bloom, it needs, among other things, of course, good soil and plenty of light. But similarly, for national cultures to bloom, they need to be rooted, the current bloom of it needs to be rooted in some richly sedimented history, and they cannot be too overshadowed by the overbearing canopies of neighboring cultures. Hungary's story is one of their sedimented soil of their history being carted away or salted, and they are constantly in the shadow of the canopies of greater neighboring cultures. As a result, they've had to become quite skilled, constant gardeners of national identity. As Geza Ottlik wrote in his 1959 book, The School on the Frontier, which I think is required reading in most Hungarian schools, he wrote, "We have grown used to celebrating the lost battles we have survived. Perhaps we have also grown used to seeing defeat as being of some richer, denser stuff than victory. Certainly, in any case, more truly our own." In the 1940s, the great Hungarian philosopher Sándor Karácsony described Hungarians as a nation of firefighters. And in the 80s, another scholar wrote that for a people whose chief claim to fame is that they have preserved their national identity in the face of major threats, history is a deadly serious business. The point is, Hungarians faced with stolen soil and lost light have preserved a strong sense of cultural and national identity through a constant, almost obsessive, dialogue amongst themselves about precisely what being Hungarian is and means, and at the center of these debates in the theme of adversity and loss and the fierce pride and collective sense, and at the center of these debates is the theme of adversity and loss and the fierce pride and the collective sense of sort of FU in having survived it, of remaining against all odds. This is all no more so, I think, than in the wake of their most recent heroic failure, the Hungarian Revolution of '56. As Hannah Arendt wrote in a typically perceptive essay, Totalitarian Imperialism, Reflections on the Hungarian Revolution, published only 16 months after the events of October and November 1956, the revolution's historical importance depended, she wrote, not on victory or defeat, but rather on the tragedy it enacted. She meant it in the sense that it, to quote her, illuminated the immense landscape of post-war totalitarianism for 12 long days. But I think to the Hungarians, it also both illuminated and reaffirmed something simply about being Hungarian itself. So what was the Hungarian Revolution? In many ways, the causes or grievances behind it were straightforward enough. There are the broader historical tides, of course, the end of World War II, with Hungary having joined, as they often do, what ended up being the losing side, in this case, arguably because, as I said, they hoped to reclaim lost territory, lost in Trianon in 1920. As the Soviets swept in and occupied the country, the Hungarians were not simply treated as a colony, but as a defeated enemy, subjected to looting and rape, the former being not just by soldiers but by the Soviet state, with a third of the country's gold reserves and a third of industry and factories being shipped to Russia, and $200 million in 1938 dollars being paid in reparations, as well as $50 million to Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia next door. In fact, 40% of Hungary's income in the years after the war was lost to reparations and looting. The latter, the rape, led to the liberalization, in fact, to abortion laws in Hungary, as about 1 in 18 women were raped after the war. A common saying at the time was that we've had 3 great tragedies in the history of Hungary: the Tatar conquest in the 13th century, the 150-year Turkish occupation, and the Soviet liberation. Partly because of reparations and looting and also poor harvest, the economy in the late 40s saw record hyperinflation, with the US dollar going from being worth about 1,300 pengos to 4.6 quadrillion by 1946, which is 14 zeros, by the way. And then, as well as the historical tides, are the kind of societal currents. From the late 1940s to the eve of the revolution in October 56, Hungary lived under the most oppressive dictatorship in the Eastern Bloc. Rákosi, who might be compared to Stalin or Mao in terms of his monstrousness, had been tasked by Stalin with building a model Stalinist state. He engaged in what he called salami tactics, sowing division within opposition parties and framing opposition figures and blackmailing them until no opposition was left. He then nationalized all banks and businesses of over 10 people. He then rolled back the redistribution of land to the peasants from the nobility, which had happened right after the war, and instituted collectivized farming, turning those peasants into serfs. They began to try and turn also a predominantly agricultural economy into one based on heavy industry, despite Hungary not being very well suited to that. Russian also began to be taught. The flag was changed to include a hammer and sickle. All national holidays were changed to those of the USSR. Christmas Day became Pine Needle Day, for instance. Coffee houses were denounced as bourgeois and closed. Even army meal times were shifted from dinner to lunch, as it was in the Soviet army. As one student commented, having communism thrust down our throats unwillingly was bad enough, but having so many alien ways imposed on us and being told they were superior was a constant insult. We couldn't forgive them. Worse, the AVO, the secret police, were modeled on what became known after 1954 as the KGB and became the most brutally efficient in Europe. By 1953, half of the 850,000 Communist Party members in Hungary were either in prison, labor camps, exiled, or dead. A joke at the time was there are still 3 classes in this country: those who have been in jail, those who are in it, and those who will be. Rákosi modeled himself on Stalin, building a personality cult around himself, decreeing that the word wise only be applied to himself. But he knew also that Stalin loathed him. The more fear he had of his master, the more sycophantic he became, and the more ruthless, therefore, in Hungary in his preemptive efforts to fulfill what he thought would be Stalin's wishes. All the interference in the economy had by the 50s brought it to the brink of collapse. Famine was widespread in the countryside and living standards dropped 20%. There were 3 types of shops: one for the ordinary people, long queues for few goods; another type of shop for the elite, where items were cheaper and sometimes Western; and another for the Russians, where everything was simply half price. It was also revealed that Hungary had one of the world's largest deposits of uranium, and the Russians had kept the secret from the Hungarians and were basically stealing with it, making the Hungarians pay for the infrastructure while shipping it back to the Soviet Union. And then also there were the more proximate sort of political waves that were happening in 1956. In February 56, Khrushchev gave a speech in which he condemned Stalin, who died 3 years earlier, as a mass murderer, and Stalinism as part of the problem, not the solution for the future of the Soviet Union. The speech was reported later by Radio Free Europe and sparked questions in Hungary about Rákosi's future, given that he had modeled himself on Stalin, and began a slow mutation of a national culture of fear to one of anger at the poverty, at dictatorial control, and at the Soviets in general. So these were the identifiable causes or grievances, and there were many others, but these are the main ones that left Budapest and the country a tinderbox on the eve of the revolution on the 22nd of October 56. Yet, despite all these reasons, the Hungarian Revolution was, in Arendt's phrase, totally unexpected and took everyone by surprise, the Hungarians not least, and was, as she's argued, above all else, a spontaneous and indeed an acephalous, a leaderless revolution. A sudden, to quote her, a sudden uprising of an oppressed people for the sake of freedom and hardly anything else, without the demoralizing chaos of military defeat preceding it, without coup d'etat techniques, without a closely knit apparatus of organizers and conspirators, without the undermining propaganda of a revolutionary party. As one Hungarian professor said shortly afterwards to the UN, it was unique in history that the Hungarian Revolution had no leaders. It was not organized. It was not centrally directed. The will for freedom was the moving force in every action. Another writer, Victor Sebastian, has written that this revolution was marked by idealism and breathless excitement, as well as by violence and utter confusion. Sometimes it was not always entirely clear who was fighting for whom, or indeed for what. He's described it as the least organized revolution in history. There were no leaders, no plans, he writes. Protesters unknown to one another would come together for a firefight and then disperse, never to meet again. Arendt herself had noted that the driving force behind the revolution itself was less an interest in ameliorating material misery, but exclusively about truth and freedom, the throwing off of an alien and even artificial set of norms and verities, creating space to simply be free, to be truly Hungarian. This, she writes, was, to quote her, the ultimate affirmation that human nature is unchangeable, that nihilism will be futile, that even in the absence of all teachings and the presence of overwhelming indoctrination, a yearning for freedom and truth will rise out of man's heart and mind forever. Students shared the broader concerns about privation and dictatorship, but also had their own complaints, particularly about living conditions and the role of the communist student organizations. And so on the 22nd of October, 5,000 students, half the student body, came together in a lecture theatre at the Budapest Technological University. By midnight, they'd come up with 16 points, a manifesto for the revolution, and a march was organized for the next day. This was then banned by the government, who then changed their mind and let it go ahead for fear of just looking weak by banning it. The vacillation indeed did make the government look weak and embolden the students. Workers interested then stepped out to join them as their shifts ended, their morning shifts ended the next day. And by evening on the 23rd, someone then had turned out the lights over Parliament Square in a hope to disperse the protesters, and spontaneously people held aloft their party newspaper, A Free People, and lit them as torches. At the same time, the radio was surrounded opposite Frank Freddy's house, a child in fact. The radio opposite him was surrounded by students demanding to broadcast their demands, most concretely a Russian withdrawal from Hungary, and also to leave the Warsaw Pact and become neutral. But the radio station tricked them. They said, yes, you can broadcast it, but they didn't turn on the receiver. And this, when the students discovered, enraged them and inflamed the crowd. And then other demonstrations spontaneously emerged across the city, including in Heroes Square, where they tore down the giant statue of Stalin. And on all of these protests, they were shouting, Russians, go home. But back at the radio station, 2 students were shot as the security forces tried to clear the streets. News of this spread across the city. Troops were sent to suppress the rioting students. But when the troops arrived, they simply handed their weapons to the students and returned to barracks. Suddenly, protests had turned into an armed insurrection. Overnight, the government that had dictated everything in Hungary for 8 long years collapsed, losing control over the city. The protesters called a general strike, and indeed army commanders no longer knew if the lower ranks would even obey them. By the 3rd day, several revolutionary strongholds were formed across the city, most famously the Corvin Cinema Complex. And the Russians were very taken aback by this, and initially they backed off. But on the 26th, they massacred dozens of protesters in front of Parliament. This simply then shifted the revolution from exhilaration to a sort of hardened determination and swelled the movement. And by later that day, the revolution had spread across the country to Pécs, Debrecen, Győr, and Miskolc, among other places, but mostly cities. The revolutionary fever went on for a total of about 12 days. The revolutionaries, the Hungarians in general, gaining confidence that they might in fact succeed, that they might throw off and throw out the Soviets. The result, however, was never really in the hands of the Hungarians, still less the revolutionaries themselves. As Sebastian has argued, Hungary was a pawn, trapped between bigger powers. In 1956, its fate was not decided on the streets of Budapest by the Hungarians' heroes, or indeed the villains or charlatans. All the major decisions were made by the power brokers in Moscow and in Washington. Although the Soviet leadership vacillated for the best part of a week over what to do, and they did go back and forward as to whether they would meet some of the demands or not, In the end, they couldn't and wouldn't risk the threat that these revolutionary ideas would spread contagiously across their new empire, and still more they were worried about emboldening the West by looking weak. And then for his part, the US President Eisenhower was preoccupied at the time with his election the following week, his re-election, as well as with another imperial crisis in Suez, which was also happening the same week, and which they feared could spread the Cold War to an entirely new continent. The Americans cheered on the revolution, and indeed it had stoked excitement about liberation for years with pro-democracy propaganda, including Radio Free Europe, but would offer it no material or political support when it finally happened, fearing it could escalate to a Third World War. As for the UN, it was preoccupied itself with Suez, and UN delegates would not even read the telexes from Budapest, the text being left unread in their pigeonholes. Indeed, the UN Secretary General did in fact fly to mediate a crisis that week, but it wasn't to Moscow or Budapest, it was to Cairo. So by the 4th of November, 150,000 troops and 2,500 tanks had entered Hungary from neighboring Soviet satellite states as part of the aptly named Operation Whirlwind, taking advantage in part of the world's attention being mainly on Suez, and also some false promises they'd given the Hungarians about the possibility of a compromise. At 4 a.m. on that day, with the code word Thunder, the shelling of the city began. Due to the false promises, the Hungarian army took no defensive actions, hoping for the best. Only the rebel bands of mostly young people and students resisted, and they were mercilessly crushed, whole buildings being brought down on top of them if they shot from them. And to this day you can find, there's a word in Hungarian, which again I'll probably butcher, Frank, which is the foghias, which means missing tooth building. And throughout Budapest there are still these missing buildings. The revolution ended quickly, and communism was restored until 1990. Yet what the revolution did was what all collective tragedies seem to have done to the Hungarians. It forged in adversity a sense that they were first and foremost Hungarian, an identity that transcended class, region, generation, and political identities. As Aaron has written, the Hungarian people, young and old, knew that they were living amidst lies and rose up to demand freedom of thought, and the revolution then, quote, spread like wildfire until nobody in Hungary was left outside its ranks except the members of the political police, the only Hungarians prepared to defend the regime. As she writes, once the student demonstration had transformed into an armed uprising, quote, no programs, points, or manifestos played any role. What carried the revolution was the sheer momentum of acting together of the whole people, whose demands were so obvious that they hardly needed elaborate formulation. She goes on to say, no group, no class in the nation opposed the will of the people once it had become known and its voice had been heard in the marketplace. And she went on to say, it was as though ideology of whatever shade and brand had simply been wiped out of existence and memory in the moment that people, intellectuals and workers, communists and non-communists, found themselves together in the streets fighting for freedom. The Hungarian Revolution was overwhelmingly a movement, therefore, that was not so much intended, but which had the effect of trying to create space for a life free from received and foreign artifice, and that embraced the freedom to seek what is authentic to the nation in question. The cathartic act of resistance against overwhelming adversity was itself the philosophy that bound them together and restored a sense of what it is not just to be a Hungarian, but to act like one. To this day, the memory of the collective act of attempting the revolution remains a central plank of Hungarian identity. Indeed, on the political right in Hungary, Orbán himself rose to fame quoting the revolution's slogan of Russians go home at the reburial of the revolutionary hero Imre Nagy, who had been prime minister briefly and was executed in 1989. At this reburial, that's how he became well known in Hungary. But it's not simply on the right. If you go to a Budapest cafe, you often see the hipsters serving you coffee have dates tattooed into their arms, which is usually the date at which a grandfather of theirs or a grandmother of theirs acted in the revolution and was shot. It's a very common tattoo you see around Budapest on people who definitely would not be supporting the Hungarian government. So it's a great unifying narrative, the revolution. So what's the relevance of this revolution of 56 to the disorders we're experiencing in the Anglosphere in 2022 or in recent years? Just like Hungary and Britain itself, there are, I think, some interesting parallels and some important differences, both of which I think are quite illuminating. Clearly, from a Soviet perspective, the revolution itself was a pathology in need of a cure, the cure just being more communism. And clearly to the Hungarians, communism was a disease and the revolution was the cure. Now the former is clearly wrong, although we do have, I think, a few old communists in the room. But arguably, so too, I think, is the latter. For the revolution, of course, failed. It proved to be no cure. Communism remained for another 33 years. Little was politically or materially achieved for Hungary. Indeed, probably the major effect of the Hungarian Revolution against communism was it really pulled the rug out from communist parties in France, the UK, and other countries where people would be, they suddenly saw the real, the terror involved in totalitarianism. Yeah, that's fine. But even if it's not a cure, we can perhaps say the revolution was a symptom of a disease in need of a cure, the disease of overbearing communism. In Hungarians, the word for revolution is in fact forradalom, the boiling over of the masses, like a fever. This definition perhaps gets it more right, I think, than the English word of revolution. And this seems relevant here today, as in the contemporary Anglosphere, we're also, I think, seeing revolutionary zeal, or forradalom, boiling over of the masses, and from both sides of the political spectrum. On the right, or more accurately, more in the provinces, to speak very generally, we've seen sort of the Trump movement and the Brexit movements in the UK. And then on the left, or more accurately in the cities, we've seen these sort of social justice movements emerge. And as we all know, we live in very polarized times, and these two movements often see themselves as antithetical, respectively seeing the other as a disease and themselves as the cure. Thus, the typical metropolitan view of Brexit is that it was a pathology, that Leave voters were one or all of immoral, racist, or stupid, or manipulated. And then on the other side, there's an assumption that the woke are stupid or bad faith or trying to destroy society. But perhaps both sides are wrong. Perhaps rather than seeing in either side being the disease or the cure, perhaps both sides are simply symptoms of deeper problems, that they are forradalom, the boiling over of the masses in response to deeper problems. And just perhaps they are symmetrical symptoms of the same underlying disease. And in our case, perhaps it's not overbearing communism, but perhaps overbearing capitalism. Certainly, the typical, to speak very generally, the typical sort of Trump or Brexit voter is, characterized or caricatured as sort of older, more provincial, less of university educated, and so on. Precisely the people who've seen their industries close or shipped overseas in the north of England or middle America in the age of global neoliberalism, and seen their lives and livelihoods hollowed out as a consequence. But of course, the same can be said of the woke sort of people too, who are typically, again, to generalize and caricature, younger, metropolitan, university educated. But they look at them, they have very little job security, massive student debt, impossible house prices, not very good prospects. They're also suffering from the same neoliberal economic policies. What we're seeing, I think, in these two movements boiling up, what we're seeing are these two movements boiling up, and yet rather than identifying the source of their respective suffering, they tend to be pointing the finger at each other. And corporations, of course, delighted by this. As long as people on the right are riled by niche culture war issues, they aren't looking at the structural economic ones. And as long as the left is preoccupied with social justice issues, it serves the corporations in a number of ways. Of course, if you call the people who voted for Trump a basket of deplorables, you're missing the real grievances they have about their jobs being shipped off overseas. So the corporations are given they're not blamed for this. In allying themselves with social justice narratives, these corporations can woke-wash their brands. And of course, by the imposition of this sort of HR-driven, prescriptive social justice policies within corporations, you're leaving the employees scared and worried, which makes them far more tractable to corporations. But also, as long as the right are preoccupied with immigration, they're missing the economic system that necessitates it. And as long as the left is preoccupied with the racial lens on all societal problems, they're missing the way this disguises the economic and class contours of all the real social problems we've got. And as long as the two sides are thinking the other as the pathology and themselves as the cure, neither is diagnosing the shared disease to which they are both symmetrical, if antithetical, symptoms. So to conclude, perhaps therefore the major difference between the Hungarian forradalom and the current forradalom revolution in the Anglosphere is that faced with overbearing communism, the Hungarians found national solidarity transcendent of class, region, profession, education, or politics. Whereas now, faced with overbearing capitalism, in the Anglosphere, we're seeing widening divisions between classes, regions, professions. Think of the virtuals and the physicals, if you've heard that analysis, and different educational levels in politics. We're being divided, not unified, in the face of these things. In this failure to find something in common in the face of a common threat, we are perhaps you could argue, as much victims of our historical triumphs as the Hungarians are unlikely beneficiaries of their historical tragedies. Our society in the Anglosphere has simply lost sight of the importance of collective identity and solidarity. Just like with our emotional remove from our history, why would we feel something about our national identity if it has never really faced repeated existential threats? Our very success has atomized us materially and socially. National identity gets a bad rap, of course, because of the dangers of weaponizing it through demagoguery. But as a source of solidarity in the face of adversity, it has some value, as the Hungarians know. Now, I wouldn't want to suggest that the adversity we face, the privations and manipulations we suffer today, are remotely comparable to those Hungarians suffered under the Rákosi regime. But there are some telling parallels in form, if not degree. We may not have secret police gathering data on us, but our data is the most valuable commodity in the 21st century, held not by communist regimes, but corporations and inevitably governments. Our countries may not have been looted, but our livelihoods and communities have been stripped out, the jobs and factories moved overseas. We may not be instituting collectivized farming, stealing the land from small farmers, but as we can see right now in Holland, we are, in the name of, for instance, the climate, making farming unviable as a livelihood. In the latter case, we are both losing our literal connection with the soil and also our figurative connection with our sedimented history, farming being one of the last livelihoods we have that existed before the Industrial Revolution. In the face of all this, as we find ourselves woven into the web of artificial norms and verities imposed from above and understood globally, rather than organically grown from the cultural soil where we are and sensitive to the particularity of our real lives, is it any wonder we live in an age of ferment and disorder, where people keep talking about, as the Hungarians did, a wish for freedom and truth? Although have you noticed that when people articulate their interest in freedom and truth, it's in the language of atomization, about personal freedom and indeed my truth. The Hungarians did not have the scale to triumph in their revolution. They are forever a small nation between greater powers. But the paradox is this adversity did give them a sense of collective identity to attempt a revolution aimed at the right target. Today, in the final paragraph, today in the Anglosphere, we have the opposite situation. We are not a small culture. In theory, we have the scale to force change, but we are aimed at the wrong target, each other. As a consequence of our very success and overcoming adversity, our sense of collective identity is so weak that we may not be able to stop pathologizing each other and find the space, indeed the freedom, to recognize that the real pathology we face is in truth a shared one. If we're interested in rectifying this fundamental problem, if we are to stop ourselves becoming victims of our own success, we might look to the Hungarian experience. If we did, it's possible that the tragedy it enacted might have importance in illuminating not just the dangers of communism in the 20th century, but of capitalism in the 21st, and what is required of us to confront it. And I think it's important that we do this, because at stake here is a great deal, arguably even more than was lost at the Battle of Mohács. Thank you very much.